After studying this module, you should be able to know about Viktor Frankl and existential psychology, learn about logotherapy, understand the basic features of Frankl's theory, learn about various concepts associated with psychopathology, analyze the techniques of logotherapy, and evaluate the theory of Viktor Frankl. One must keep in mind, as it is very important when one discusses about existentialism, that it is not an attempt to construct a wholly new school of psychological thought. In contrast, existentialism does not contradict other schools of psychology. Existential psychology means to look at human existence on a structural level. Additionally, in distinction to other schools of psychology, it did not originate from the work of a single founder. It started instinctively in numerous regions of Europe from the philosophies of diverse individuals, with many of these creative minds having no knowledge of the amazingly similar exertions of one another. This spur of the moment nature of its beginning makes clear the need that was felt for its manifestation. Even though the leaders of existential psychology belonged to different schools, maximum were either practiced Freudian or Jungian psychoanalytic. Even though the leaders of existential psychology belonged to different schools, maximum were either practicing Freudian or Jungian psychoanalytic techniques. They did not disagree that their use of these techniques fashioned cures, but established that in sticking to just the assumptions of Freud and Jung, they were incapable to make sense of why such cures followed. Moreover, they questioned what was truly going on at the level of their patients' existence. As such was the case, they followed a thoughtful As such was the case, they considered psychological disturbances from the theme of understanding that they are structural unconventionalities in individuals' existence, somewhat deviations from a psychologist's or psychiatrist's theoretical measure. Central to existentialism is the notion that existence conveys main concerns than essence. Although essence put forward an invariable and irreversible substance, existence indicates process. Rather than concentrating upon an ultimate product or essence, existentialists highlight constant personal change. Existentialism going on to observe and give a picture of man, the human being, from a situation that encounters the dilemma between acquisitiveness and idealism. Its backgrounds lie in objections of the rationalistic and idealistic perceptions of man as a simple subject or as be subjected to reality only through thought. Similarly, existentialism disputes the treatment of man as a sheer object that may perhaps be computationally assumed. It embraces that the human being should be perceived through the lens of development and growth or existence. As a result, existential psychologists and psychiatrists hold the detail that persons occur to exist or to be in their dynamic approaches. From the existentialist idea of interpretation, all that is recognized about an individual loses meaning if their existence or being is not reserved. Keeping in mind the existence of an individual includes reflection of the objectivity and subjectivity above the manifestation of their reality. Correspondingly, from the existential point of view, is the concept that man put up with the ultimate accountability for the course of his life. In other words, Human beings may not reasonably lay fault upon the actions of others or their environments. They shape their own existence and find that when all is said and done, they are essentially alone. Another influential theorist in existential psychology was the work of Viktor Frankl and his logotherapy.
Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was one of the prominent figures out of his work developed existential psychology. It's not surprising that his work grew out of his experiences in Nazi death camps. Observing how people survived or purged, he determined that people who had hopes of being reunited with loved ones, or who had missions they felt a need to complete, or who had great faith, inclined to have enhanced chances than those who had lost all hope. Men's Search for Meaning is one of his best known books, acknowledged by the Library of Congress as one of the 10 best influential books of the 20th century. Logotherapy and existential analysis imparts that the desire to live a life of meaning and purpose is the most important human motivation. To understand Frankl's theory and how it fits into the humanistic approach is to look at few of the assumptions highlighted by Viktor Frankl. The first assumption which Frankl came up with was that he disputed in contradiction of the deterministic nature of human being bring into being by behaviorism and psychoanalysis. According to Frankl, man is not totally conditioned and determined, but somewhat determines himself. Though he considers that there are conditions which confines this freedom, the factual issue is not freedom from conditions, but it is freedom to take a stand towards these conditions. Second assumption which Frankl suggested was that one should be able to differentiate between facts and experiences. He referred to facts as objective interpretations without subjective context and meaning. On the other hand, experiences are explanations which are attached in an individual's perspective that includes the subjective meaning. Even though he accepted that psychology as a science has traditionally stressed on detached objectivity, he proposed that in trying to comprehend experiences like those of concentration camp survivors, a detached observer is too far unconcerned to make any account of real value. That is, the meaning of human experience can only be determined by the individual having the experience. The third assumption which Frankl made was to seek meaning in the world which frequently appears as meaningless. Nevertheless, for him, meaning is not that is something immaterial philosophical issue, nor it is grounded on some universal principle. In contrast, he regarded meaning as a personal consequence which is associated both to the immediate context of one's experiences and to the attitude one has towards those experiences. There are three main mechanisms that are at the core of Viktor Frankl philosophy that are each person has a healthy core. The main focus is to make clear to a person the internal resources which they possess and provide them with the techniques to use their inner core. Life provides you purpose and meaning. It does not owe you a sense of fulfillment or happiness. Logotherapy. Viktor Frankl referred to his form of therapy as logotherapy. Logotherapy is grounded on the theory that all healing and wisdom is consequential from our neurotic dimension, and therein lays the cure for all our negative harmonies relationship, and emotions. It is from the neurotic dimension that we must collect the material essential to develop a resolution of spirit which can be used to assess necessary change in our life conditions and inner conflicts. By recognizing that we are spirit, we realize the fear of death and the thought of others inflicting harm or commanding our physical health. Each person is seen as an authentic and unique being. Our lives, beliefs, and behaviors are all expressions of our uniqueness. Logo was derived from the Greek word logos, which can mean study, word, spirit, God, or meaning. It is this last sense Frankl concentrated on, although the other meanings are also somewhat similar. He suggested that Freud basically assumed a will to pleasure as the root of all human motivation, and Adler, on the other hand, focused on a will to power. Logotherapy postulates a will to meaning. Frankl also uses the Greek word nous, which denotes mind or spirit. He put forward that we should focus on psychodynamics, which understands people as trying to reduce psychological tension. Instead, or in addition, Frankl says we should pay attention to no dynamics, wherein tension is essential for health, at least when it comes to meaning. People desire the tension involved in striving for some worthy goal. The three most fundamental characteristics which highlights the principles of logotherapy are: life has meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable ones. Our main motivation for living is our will to find meaning in life. We have freedom to find meaning in what we do and what we experience, or at least in the stand we take when faced with a situation of unchangeable suffering. Conscience. One of the key points postulated by Viktor Frankl was conscience. According to him, conscience is a sort of unconscious spirituality, unlike the instinctual unconscious that Freud and others gave emphasis to. The conscience he designates as the fundamental and key factor of our being and the source of our personal integrity. He stresses that being human is being responsible, existentially responsible, responsible for our own existence. Conscience is intuitive and highly personalized. It denotes a real person in a real situation and cannot be concentrated to simple universal laws. It must be lived. He refers to conscience as a pre reflective ontological self understanding or the wisdom of the heart, more sensitive than reason can ever be sensible. According to him, it is the conscience that gives our lives meaning. The existential vacuum. Another key concept which was stressed by Frankl was existential vacuum. It refers to striving after meaning, which can lead to frustration and ultimately leading to nogenic neurosis, what others might call spiritual or existential neurosis. He felt that individuals were experiencing their lives as empty, meaningless, purposeless, aimless, adrift, and so on, and seemed to be returning to these experiences with unusual behavior that hurt themselves, others, society, or all three. One of his favorite metaphors is the existential vacuum. We might also fill our lives with certain neurotic vicious circles, such as obsession with germs and cleanliness, or fear driven obsession with a phobic object. The central feature of these vicious circles is that whatsoever we do, it is never enough. These neurotic vicious circles are established on something Frankl denotes it as anticipatory anxiety. It referred to being afraid of getting defined anxiety related symptoms, that getting those symptoms becomes unavoidable. The anticipatory anxiety causes the very thing that one is scared of getting. For instance, test anxiety. If you are afraid of doing poorly on test, the anxiety will inhibit you from doing well on test, resulting in you being afraid of test and so on. Another notion which Frankl came up with was hyperintention. It is similar to the first one. Here, one tries too hard, which in turn prevents the person from succeeding at something. One of the most common form of hyperintention is insomnia. Many people, when they can't sleep, they keep trying to fall asleep, using every method in the book, as one is aware that trying to sleep itself prevents sleep, so the cycle continues. A third variation which Frankl referred to is hyperreflection. This denotes thinking too hard. Sometimes we expect something to happen, so it does, simply because its manifestation is intentionally tied to one's beliefs or attitudes, the self fulfilling prophecy. Psychopathology. As we have discussed earlier, Frankl had focused on the development of various psychopathologies. For instance, various anxiety neuroses are seen as originated on existential anxiety, the sting of conscience, the individual not accepting that his anxiety is due to his sense of unfulfilled responsibility and a lack of meaning, takes that anxiety and emphasizes it upon some challenging detail of life. The hypochondriac, for example, focuses his anxiety on some horrible disease. The phobic focuses on some object that has caused him concern in the past. The agoraphobic sees anxiety stemming from the world outside. The patient with stage fright or speech anxiety tend to lay emphasis on the stage or the podium. The anxiety neurotic thus makes sense of his or her discomfort with life. Frankl suggested that sometimes, not always, it serves to intimidate a member of the family or is used to validate oneself to others or to the self, but warns that this is secondary to the deeper issues. Frankl focused on few disorders and how they develops in an individual. Obsessive compulsive disorder also occurs in a same way. According to Frankl, persons suffering with obsessive compulsive disorder lacks the sense of completion that most people have. For instance, a simple task like locking one's door at night, normally an individual will be satisfied, but an obsessive compulsive requires a perfect certainty that it is eventually impossible. Because perfection in all things is even for the obsessive compulsive an impossibility, he or she then starts to pay attention on those aspects of life that has caused problems in the past. The therapist should make an attempt to help the patient to relax and not fight the tendencies to repeat thoughts and actions. Additionally, the patient needs to come to identify his temperamental predispositions towards perfection as fate and learn to accept at least a small degree of uncertainty. Nevertheless, finally, the obsessive compulsive and the anxiety neurotic as well must find meaning. As soon as life's fullness of meaning is rediscovered, the neurotic anxiety no longer has anything to fasten on. Frankl, like other existential psychologists, recognizes the significance of genetic and physiological factors on psychopathology. For instance, he views depression as initiated in a vital low, that is, a diminishment of physical energy. On the psychological level, he relates depression to the feeling of insufficiency we feel when we are threatened by tasks that are beyond our abilities, physical or mental. Whereas on the spiritual level, Frankl sees depression as tension between what the people is and what he ought to be. The person's goal seems inaccessible to him, and he loses a sense of his own future. Over time, he becomes appalled at himself and projects that revolution onto others or even humanity in general. The ever present gap between what is and what should be becomes a gaping abyss. Schizophrenia. According to Frankl, schizophrenia is also the result of physiological dysfunction. But here person experiences himself as an object rather than a subject. Most of us, when we have thoughts, identify them as coming from within our own minds. We owe them as one can put in simple terms. Whereas a schizophrenic, for reasons still not understood, is forced to take a passive perspective on those thoughts and perceive them as voices. The schizophrenic may watch himself and distrust himself, which he experiences passively as being watched and persecuted. Frankl considers that this passivity is ingrained in an inflated tendency to self observation. It is as if there were a separation of the self as viewer and the self as viewed. The viewing self, lacking of content, seems barely real, while the viewed self seems unfamiliar. Even though logotherapy was not intended to deal with severe psychosis, Frankl still feels that it can help. By teaching the schizophrenic to ignore the voices and stop the constant self observation while simultaneously leading him or her towards meaningful activity, the therapist may be able to short circuit the vicious cycle. Therapy. Viktor Frankl is approximately as well known for certain clinical details of his approach as for his overall theory and treatment techniques he has provided. Frankl comes up with three main techniques in logotherapy, which are namely paradoxical intention, de-reflection, and self-transcendence. The first of these techniques is referred to as paradoxical intention, which is useful in breaking down the neurotic vicious cycles brought on by anticipatory anxiety and hyperintention. Paradoxical intention includes asking for the thing we fear the most. For clients who suffer anxiety or phobias, fear can paralyze them. However, by using humor and ridicule, they can wish for the thing they fear the most, thus removing the fear from their intention and relieving the anxious symptoms associated with it. In other words, it refers to wishing the very thing you are afraid of. A second technique which was highlighted by Frankl was de-reflection, is used when a person is overly self-absorbed on an issue or attainment of a goal. By shifting one's attention or de-reflecting the attention away from the self, the person can fully become whole by thinking about others rather than themselves. Frankl believes that many problems stems from an overemphasis on oneself. The third technique suggested by Frankl was Socratic dialogue. It is a technique in which the logotherapist uses the own personal words as a method of self discovery. By listening intently to what the person says, the therapist can point out specific patterns of words or word solutions to the client and let the client see new meaning in them. This process allows a person to realize that the answer lies within them and is just waiting to be discovered. Criticism of logotherapy. Rollo may suggested that Frankl has come with simple solutions to all of life's problems, an assertion that would seem to undermine the complexity of human life itself. May contended that if a patient could not find his own meaning, Frankl would provide a goal for his patient. In effect, this would negate the patient's personal responsibility, thus diminishing the patient as a person, suggesting it as authoritarian. Logotherapy has been criticized for its similarities to religion. Frankl's therapeutic technique leads people to discover the meaning or higher purpose in their lives. Critics have said this method is similar to the belief in God or a higher power, and that the foundation of logotherapy is based in faith rather than in science. Frankl eventually stopped advocating for religion as part of logotherapy and maintained that his method facilitated change through deep spiritual, emotional, and physical awareness.
Now let us summarize this module. Viktor Frankl was one of the prominent figures whose work developed existential psychology. It's not surprising that his work grew out of his experiences in Nazi death camps. Man's Search for Meaning is one of his best known books, acknowledged by the Library of Congress as one of the 10 best influential books of the 20th century. Logotherapy and existential analysis imparts that the desire to live a life of meaning and purpose is the most important human motivation. According to Frankl, and I quote, "Man is not totally conditioned and determined, but somewhat determines himself." Unquote. Though he considers that there are conditions which confines this freedom, the factual issue is not freedom from conditions, but it is freedom to take a stand towards these conditions. Logotherapy is grounded in the theory that all healing and wisdom is consequential from our neurotic dimension, and therein lays the cure for all of our negative harmonies, interactions, and feelings. Logo was derived from the term logos, which can mean study, word, spirit, or meaning. It is this last sense Frankl concentrated on, although the other meanings are also somewhat similar. The three most fundamental characteristics which highlight the principles of logotherapy are: life has significance at any cost. Our key drive for living is our will to search for meaning, and one has liberty to search for meaning in whatever one does. One of the key points postulated by Viktor Frankl was conscience. According to his, conscience is a sort of unconscious spirituality, unlike the instinctual unconscious that Freud and others gave emphasis to. Another key concept which was stressed by Frankl was existential vacuum. It refers to striving after meaning, which can lead to frustration and ultimately lead to neogenic neurosis, what others might call spiritual or existential neurosis. Anticipatory anxiety refers to being afraid of getting definite anxiety related symptoms, that receiving those signs which becomes unavoidable. Hyperintention. It is similar to the first one. Here one tries too hard, which in turn prevents the person from succeeding at something. Frankl had focused on the development of various psychopathologies. For instance, various anxiety neuroses are seen as originating from existential anxiety, the sting of conscience. Frankl came up with three main techniques in logotherapy, which are namely paradoxical intention, dereflection, besides self transcendence. Rollo May suggested that Frankl has come with simple solutions to all of life's problems, an assertion that would seem to undermine the complexity of human life itself. This therapy is condemned, meant for its resemblances to religion. Frankl's therapeutic technique leads individuals to determine the meaning or higher resolve in their lives.